for those of you who are joining us tonight, thank you very much. I'm Debbie Givens. I'm the current chair of RIPPT, and I am very pleased to continue to offer this seminar series through the consortium. I just want to announce that this is our July seminar series, and we have two more webinars planned, and one is tentatively planned for August 24th, and it will be by Neva Kirk Sanchez and Jen Stevens Lapsley. I should read my paper on recruiting PhD students, the financial rewards and pitfalls. And that would, again, is tentatively planned for the 24th of August at this same time, 7:30 to 8:30 Eastern time. And then in September on the 14th, we have Sujay Galen and Terry Grindstaff, who are going to talk about using partnerships to build research productivity. So we're looking at people who are aspirational for being RIPPT programs to talk about how they're building their research productivity towards a research intensive program. And so again, look for that on September 14th. And then hopefully you'll be at ELC in Atlanta, and RIPPT is having a Sunday morning program, a 90-minute program on how a research infrastructure benefits the education of DPT students in the development of faculty. I will lead that group with David Brown from UTMB, Jules DeWald from Northwestern, and Darcy Reisman from Delaware. So I look forward to you all participating in the next seminars we have planned. So without further ado, I'll introduce Carol and Mary to take it off with this webinar.
Thank you, Debbie. We're happy to be here talking about the impact of COVID-19 on rehabilitation research. And we thought about this. We thought about how we've all made it through this year. We're happy to do it, but it has had an impact. And so I'm happy to have Stacy Dusing talking about her research and how things have impacted it. She is a graduate of, she's a graduate of Damon College's physical therapy, but then she went to UNC for her master's and PhD, and then came over to VCU to start her motor development lab, and it worked tremendously hard to get some outside funding to support it. And then at the beginning of COVID, right after it had begun, she moves over to University of Southern California. And we were sorry to lose her, but it was a wonderful opportunity. And so she continues to do a great job adapting to both the challenges of being distant from the lab, but also going through COVID. So Stacy, I'm glad to have you here and hope that we can learn something from you.
All right, thank you so much, Mary. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's a nice small group. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of my experience and how we've managed some changes with COVID. But given the size of the group, please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and ask questions, or you can chat them if that's easier for you to try to do that. But I know we'll have time for a conversation and questions. So as Mary had commented on, I made a transition to the University of Southern California. I was all planned and ready to move to be here for April 1st of 2020. So of course, right as COVID hit, but the plan all along had been that I was going to leave a clinical trial running in Virginia. And so we had made some plans to keep a trial up and running there. I had an R01 that was in year 2. It's a neonatal intensive care unit trial of physical therapy for young infants. And because our inclusion criteria was based on the eligibility criteria for early intervention in the state, then their state mandated guidelines, we just didn't think it made sense to try to move the trial. And so VCU was willing to let me keep my lab open there and do some back and forth. Because I go back and forth to NIH every 3 months for study section anyway, I thought, great, I'm going to just go back and forth to VCU every 3 months. I'll be able to, be there with my PhD students and mentor every 3 months. I'll stay for 2 or 3 weeks when I go. And this will just be easy to manage. So clearly not easy to manage. And I have not been back. I actually will be back in Virginia next week for the first time since I moved to Los Angeles physically. But we thought we'd talk a little bit about what we've done in terms of intervention and the impact on research. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the new questions that we have generated as a result of being involved in all the changes that we had to go through with COVID. And then last, a little bit of the impact, I think, on students, because I think that's really important for us to reflect on, both within our own students, but also as a profession, that we're going to have PhD students who have different training if this is when they did their research. So just as a quick overview, the study that we're doing that I'm mostly going to talk about is, we call it SPEEDY for short. So it's supporting play, early exploration and development intervention. So it's an infant, preterm infant clinical trial. And so the biggest challenge for this was that most of our infants are enrolled in the neonatal intensive care unit, and then it's a 3-arm trial. So some babies start intervention in the NICU. That's additional research-based intervention. Some start 3 months after discharge from the NICU, and then there's a control group. And so when COVID hit, we were 20 kids into enrollment, all of whom were in active enrollment or an active intervention or active follow-up. So the kids are followed for 2 years in this study. And so we went, okay, what do we do now? The hospital said you can't, or the university said we can't do active research anymore. And so we reached out to the IRB and said, tell us the real rules. Like, how do we manage this? And so the negotiation with the IRB was that anything in the inpatient unit we could continue to do if it was done by staff who already were in the unit. So I was really fortunate, and it was just a great reinforcement of the benefit of clinical collaboration, that I have PTs that are on staff in the hospital, in the NICU, who already worked for me as clinical trialists. So they've been doing intervention and assessment for the clinical trial. They've been working with me for years. Those were the only people who were able to do all recruitment, all assessment, and all intervention for all the kids that were in the neonatal intensive care unit. And then as soon as a kid left the NICU, we had to convert to either remote, everything remote, or put them on pause. But as anybody knows who's done clinical trial work, that's not real easy to do, to put kids on pause for a long period of time. So what we ended up doing was flipping our intervention to telemedicine. And doing it pretty quickly. So in 3 days, we had an entire website built out that would allow us to do coaching with parents, where we had videos of what they were supposed to be doing with the babies. We were very fortunate that we had already recorded all those videos pre-COVID for another project we were working on. And then we had to go through a process of converting our assessments, which, if you work with infants or you know anything about assessment, or you just have tried to assess a young child, this was really interesting to try to figure out how to do in a valid and reliable way. So what we ended up doing was developing scripts so that the assessor, who's a physical therapist, would call the parent. They had a script for how to prompt the parent to get the child to do the standardized developmental assessment items. We shipped them the assessment kit or dropped it off on their front porch. And initially, the first 6 months only provided brand new in the box toys so that the family knew they hadn't been used by anyone else. So they would open everything up. They would be coached through doing the assessment. Then they would pack everything back up in a plastic bin and put it on their front porch, and we would come pick it up, or we gave them return shipping to send it back to us to do that. So that required the study coordinator to set the visit up ahead of time, to get all the Zoom set up ahead of time. It probably tripled the amount of time it took to do every visit, and we got about half the data we needed, because you couldn't do everything that we needed to do with the kids. We also had an MRI component that was completely shut. because we were not allowed to bring kids in because it was considered an optional MRI. It wasn't required for clinical service. So that had to be ended, or at least put on pause temporarily. So this made the whole process fairly challenging. As you can imagine, as a parent, this was really a lot to ask, to say, like, coach your kid through the assessment while managing your cell phone or getting someone else to hold your phone. So our attrition rate went from 3% to 40% attrition for kids who were already enrolled in the trial, who were already really vested in the trial. Our recruitment rate went from over 50% of eligible infants enrolling in the study to 10% of eligible infants enrolling, even though they could start in the NICU. So that's a huge number, a huge loss. And so that's persisted for about 10 months. We're back now to our pre-COVID numbers. Everything's, kind of up and running at this point, but it's a longitudinal study for 2 years. So we have 10 months of gapped data in the middle. So, or we have data that was collected remotely. So what we've been doing is, in our transition back to in-person, of course, it was a phased transition back in of, okay, now we can do things in person, but we can't do it in their home the way we used to do it. So they would come to the clinic. So what we're doing now is asking families to consent to essentially double assessment. So we assess them remotely and assess them in person so that we can look at the reliability of the assessments and the validation of the assessment in person and remotely, which will be a very interesting body of work to talk about, is this something we could do in the future, particularly for rural health related issues, as we look at kind of moving forward. However, we do have a lot of families who have said, like, no, I'm not doing the telemedicine thing anymore if I don't have to. Please, can I just come in? So we have families driving over 2 hours to come in sometimes for a visit when they're allowed to come on site, when we can't come to them yet because of the restrictions for community research, because they would rather do that than do it in telemedicine, because it's that taxing on families to do telemedicine with infants. So that's been an interesting process. The good thing for that is that we, again, have these new questions to work on asking. We also added in a qualitative study. So we've been working qualitatively. We have a qualitative researcher who joined our team in order to be able to ask questions about parents' perceptions of early intervention provided via telemedicine, as well as the transition from NICU to home, which we were asking pre-COVID and post-COVID and during COVID. So we'll have some interesting data to be able to look at what the impact was on families and family dynamics during that time. The challenge for those of you who have tried to manage this through with an already funded project, they didn't say what they're going to do financially. So we just finished year 3. We are estimating that it's about an extra $300,000 that we need plus a year to be able to recuperate this, because essentially anyone who is in the longitudinal follow-up, we don't know if we can count their data. And NIH's response to this has been, well, wait and see, at the end of year 5, you can ask us for extra money. And we're like, it's a 2-year longitudinal follow-up. We need to know now if you're going to give us extra money, because we'll stop enrolling kids. Or so it's been an interesting time to try and figure that out. So I'm meeting with the program officer again next week. The other project that just, we were actually in the process of starting up. We had just had a project funded that council met January 1st of 2020. And we were ready to start the R01 as soon as I got to Los Angeles, April 1st. Of course, we had barriers with that. Everybody knows IRBs were swamped at the initial start of COVID. So we had IRB issues and contracts and grants issues. And then NIH was really slow to release funds. So our project that was supposed to start April 1st, we got our award notice in August with a May start date. So 3 months before the notice of award came from NIH for another multi-site clinical trial. But of course, we couldn't travel to train interventionists because of COVID, and we couldn't train assessors. So we were fortunate that during the lull in COVID, sort of lull, in October, we did all of our training that we could in person and did some things remotely. So we were able to start enrolling in March as soon as our numbers started to get better, but we had to take every site as they were allowed based on their local restrictions. So everyone has to meet USC's restrictions because we're the central IRB, but then on top of that, they have to meet their own site's restrictions. So Omaha, Nebraska, no problem. They could start whenever. They don't need masks or gloves or anything. In Seattle, Washington, they still can't do community-based assessments. So huge variability within that in terms of what we're allowed to do. But we are up and running for that trial and are almost on target with our rate of enrollment. It's a little slower than we'd like, but we're within an infant a month of what we were anticipating. But again, a year behind for enrollment in terms of when we started. In terms of impact on our PhD students, this is probably the hardest thing that I feel like we've hit is that, so I have 5 PhD students between the locations where I mentor students. And those who were in the middle of collecting pilot data, getting ready for a proposal, were stopped in their tracks. And so the question becomes, do you delay them a year and let them collect data later? Do you use existing data? And what do you do with that? So I'll be really interested to hear what other people opted to do with their students. Kind of around that time, we were able to get all my students who were in that phase were able to get through using existing data or modifications of the data collection that we were able to do remotely. So I don't think it's made anybody really slow down, but I do have some colleagues who are talking about their students will have never collected data actively themselves when they graduate, which is a little bit scary for a lab-based PhD program to think about. What do you do with students who won't have collected data ever, and then moving into trying to be an independent researcher for looking at that. All right, I'm going to stop there and see if anybody has any questions. Rachel, do you want to dive right in, or do you want to see if we have questions first?
Actually, I have a quick question, Stacey. As you were talking about switching to telehealth, can you comment on how that may have changed or introduced inequities in terms of those that had the capability or internet connection or not? And only because we've seen a lot of that discussion with some of the COVID. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly there are inequity issues. The funny piece, or maybe not funny, is that the inequity goes in both directions. That it's beneficial for some families who really don't have transportation and live far away and can't get in, but can get access to internet. Or can get access to something like that. And at the same time, then you have people who had huge internet issues. We have a family who called last week and said, so I'm not going to have my cell phone with me when I come in for a visit because my 5-year-old needs to have it for school at home. And I was like, oh, you have one device and you've been trying to do everything with your one device. Like, that's a rude awakening, right? To try and figure that out. And so the way that we handled it is we converted to a website where, so we're working with babies, right? So if the baby isn't performing when you're on the telemedicine visit, we could say to the parent, do not wake them up, don't stress the baby, let's look at video together. Or if we had a family who we identified was having web-based issues, we could text them a link and say, watch this one clip. So the video, there are 50 videos on the site, and it's a specific training program. And so it goes through, and we could say, watch this video, see if your baby does any of those things, and then let's talk on the phone. And so we had to be flexible with that. So we, of course, tracked everything about how many times did it take contacting them and all that, but we allowed for a great deal of flexibility. In some was actually phone, complemented with the video resource, and some was actually watching their baby and talking through it. And so it varied a lot. And I have to say, we were actually really, really fortunate that I have a great collaborator in Australia, and we had submitted a telemedicine trial to do across Australia with the same intervention 6 months before COVID hit. So it was funded in January of 2020. And so we were in the process of putting the whole telemedicine platform together. So we already had all these professionally done videos that we were starting to record related to that. And so that's been really helpful. I wouldn't have been able to get everything up and running as quickly if we hadn't had that as a resource. Any other questions or thoughts?
All right, so we'll let Stacy come back and ask questions, and if you feel more comfortable putting them in the chat, you can go ahead and do that. But I want to take a moment, and of course, as soon as I start talking, my dogs, speaking of problems with being in Zoom meetings, have come up next to me. But Rachel is at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston and has looked at a long history of looking at clinical trials of intervention. The neat thing, unlike some of us here, is that her focus is more multidimensional: nutrition, metabolic aspects, testosterone and exercise, and really looking at functional recovery, particularly in those post-hospitalization. So Rachel will walk through with us about how that just kind of really set her up perfectly. And the neat thing about COVID is that Rachel stepped right into leading the research arm of our post-COVID recovery clinics at UTMB. So Stacy talked a bit about how to take an existing research project and kind of pivot it over in light of COVID. And Rachel's going to kind of meet her at the other end, which is how COVID and really the study of COVID allowed her to pivot some of her research interest into being a real critical piece of that effort. So Rachel.
So thank you, Carol. So as was mentioned, I'm here at UTMB, and my research prior to COVID really was on kind of optimizing the recovery after acute illness, primarily in geriatric patients on our acute care for elders. And so for the prior 7 years or so, I have been working in different clinical trials of our older adults throughout the hospital. We were doing interventions in the hospital and also post-discharge in patients to accelerate recovery, promote independence, and to decrease rehospitalization. And so that really was the focus of my research going into the pandemic. UTMB, like everywhere, shut down research. I think it was, mid-April or no, mid-March when COVID hit. They pretty much said the end, no more clinical research, get all of your animals, stored up and lines set, and pretty much shut everything down relatively rapidly because we have a biosafety level 4 here at UTMB. Animal research picked up pretty quickly. It was only shut down for about 2.5 weeks before they said we need to be able to do COVID work. We have some of the best labs here to be able to do that type of work. So we need to open those animal research centers, and human researchers were like, wait, we also want to do research. Humans also get COVID. We need to study what's going actually on with our human patients. And I was actually very lucky in that my hospital-based studies were considered to be some of the first studies and clinical trials that were allowed to come back at UTMB. We were shut down for about a month, but because we are actually housed out of the hospital, my coordinators were able to come back to work under all the same rules as are any staff or doctors or faculty or anyone was working in the hospitals. They were wearing N95s and double masking and doing face shields and all of that to come back. We shut down all of our studies that weren't clinical trials. So any of our observational studies that didn't have an active intervention, we shut down. And we didn't collect any data on those for about 6 months, but we did start back up any of our clinical trials, which were all to accelerate recovery after hospitalization in our geriatric patients. We actually were very nervous about people wanting to be recruited into clinical trials because we saw it as being a risk for them to come back to the hospital and come back to our clinics for follow-up visits. And so we were afraid that we were going to get a lot of no's. We were told by our IRB that we were not allowed to go into patients' homes. And so we couldn't decrease risk to patients by having us go into their home. They had to come back to us. They had to come back to our clinical research center. And we had to ask them a bunch of questions and do temperature and all of that prior to them coming back. We actually were very surprised in that our recruitment maintained through COVID. We did have that gap, but then we were able to maintain pretty steady recruitment, similar to our numbers pre-COVID, because it seemed like patients really didn't want to come back to the hospital, which was a very high risk COVID location. And so by us saying we can accelerate your recovery, we can help to possibly decrease your risk of rehospitalization, a lot of patients said, yes, I want to be a part of this. And we just brought them in as safely as we could. It wasn't within the hospital, but was within a separate clinic space that we brought them back for follow-ups. And so that was kind of how that work transitioned. I worked with those transitions, and it seemed like every 2 days we had some new IRB amendment that had to go through because something was changing and some new form had to be filled out. But that was pretty crazy. We got that off the ground and restarted recruitment the end of April, beginning of June. And about 2 weeks later, I was tapped by David Brown, the Dean of the School of Health Professions, because the provost had been discussing opening a post-COVID clinic. So some of the first post-COVID clinics happened in New York City, and they were opened there. We knew that post-ICU syndrome was a serious problem with patients that had COVID. Patients were suffering from these long hospitalizations, long periods of being intubated, and when they came out, they really needed specialized care. UTMB wanted to be on the front lines of opening a clinic. We're always looking to attract patients from Houston down into Galveston and to recruit patients from other hospital systems into our hospital system. And so they thought that we could be one of the first to open a post-COVID clinic. So I was actually tapped. I'm not a physical therapist or an occupational therapist or a pulmonologist. I just have my PhD, but I was tapped to be the research director of that clinic and to help the clinicians that really were clinicians and not researchers to make sure that we were collecting data in a way that we could then publish. So I worked with clinicians. We had our first meeting June 14th. And we opened the clinic and saw our first patient July 19th. So it was incredibly rapid from the time that we started meeting together. We determined what questionnaires did we want to use. UTMB put into place the fact that we couldn't see patients in person because these were patients that had COVID and were still having lingering symptoms. Thus, they failed the in-person assessment criteria, so they couldn't be seen in the clinic unless there was an emergency. Thus, we couldn't bring them in to assess them. So we needed to do all of these assessments over telehealth. So we need to determine what types of assessments were going to be valid to be given over the phone, what were the most important assessments. And then we also really wanted to make sure, because we knew that COVID and patients that were suffering after surviving COVID hospitalization had a wide range of issues: physical therapy needs, occupational therapy needs, nutritional needs, changes in support from social workers. We knew that the impact on cognition and changes in behavioral health support was going to be necessary, as well as obviously the pulmonary and cardiac services. We had all of these different clinicians that had like 17 assessments each that they wanted. And it was like, we have 45 minutes total. That's it for this assessment over the phone. And so we had to really whittle it down and determine what was going to be the most important. We did look at APTA, actually was one of the first organizations very early on in COVID to come out with some regulations and some recommendations for researchers and for clinicians as to what's a standard battery of assessments that we should collect. And so we really mimicked APTA's battery that they were saying, as well as our post-ICU batteries that were coming out of Johns Hopkins. And we set up essentially this clinic, and for the last year, I guess we've seen 10 days ago, we had our 1-year anniversary. We've seen 375 patients. New patients come through the clinic. We've had 200, at least 200 follow-up appointments with patients. A lot of those 200 we have multiple follow-up appointments with. And we actually ended up doing starting a clinical trial of those patients, just a 1-year observational study, because my work, I'm very interested in how people recover. Geriatric patients, after they're in the hospital for 3 to 5, 7 days, are extremely debilitated in terms of their function, their cognition changes. And I'm really interested in how do they improve. And so I was really interested in these post-COVID patients They just had an illness. I was thinking about patients that had been in the hospital for a really long period of time and are going to be really debilitated. How do they recover? The really interesting thing that's come out of our research is that long COVID was not a thing when we started our clinical trial. We've been extremely lucky that we started collecting data back in September. And so we have a huge cohort of data that we're coming up on 1 year of data with about 175 people, hoping to get about 300 in the end into our cohort and to be able to look at them for 3 years' time. In terms of follow-up. But one of the most interesting things has been that our clinic is actually made up of only 1/3 of patients that were, 50% of our patients were actually hospitalized, and the other 50% of our patients were never hospitalized. And so it seems like long COVID, and now there's been research and other studies that have shown similar things, that long COVID and the development of long COVID symptoms is not that you don't have to have severe COVID for it, and you actually can be asymptomatic and then show up with long lingering symptoms that tend to be cyclical and that you have problems with. So it's been an extremely interesting project to be a part of. And I've really worked with clinicians just across the board. We primarily have been working with the pulmonary and critical care specialist team because that was our medical director. But our physical therapists and our occupational therapists have been huge, have come up with questions and now launched sub-studies out of our observational trial as well. And so it's been really, really interesting. And one of the things that we've found that kind of came out of necessity was we started collaborating with St. Vincent's and with our HQFCs, which are servicing patients that don't have medical insurance or are underinsured, because our frontline workers are who tended to first get COVID and have COVID some of the worst. And a lot of those patients are Hispanic patients that are working in the front lines of your hospitality and got sick and don't have insurance and can't pay to come to a specialty clinic. And so we actually partnered with these 2 locations to really reach out to patients that need our services the most. And so that's been really beneficial over the last couple of months to begin working with those patients. It's been a slow trickle into getting into those other systems because they are not directly involved with our healthcare system. But it's been really interesting, and I've really enjoyed the work.
Questions for Rachel? Mary Beth, I see you're on, and I know you do a lot of pulmonary work. Do you have any similar experiences up at UW alongside or with long COVID? Putting her on the spot, and she may have stepped away, so.
No, I'm here. How are you?
Okay, good. I'm good. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. With the pulmonary population, we obviously had to be super careful because we weren't allowed to bring them in and do anything related to, we couldn't do any pulmonary function testings, for example. And that was a big endpoint for us, as well as VO2 max testing in patients with lymphangioliomyomatosis and IPF. So we ended up, the good news though was that we conduct our study visits at the Fred Hutch, which is already used to seeing, immunocompromised individuals and have really strict guidelines in place for study visits. So actually it ended up working to our advantage because the Fred Hutch allowed us to conduct study visits way earlier than UW actually resumed things. So we only lost, believe it or not, we only lost a few months, maybe 2 months of no collection. And then we were able to resume, and we lost a couple months after that of PFTs, because that was the very last thing that they would let us do, were PFTs. And I'll tell you one trick that worked out well was for our intervention. It was an exercise intervention. It was 12 weeks. And we weren't, I didn't want to lose obviously the fitness gains that we expected to see after 12 weeks. So patient subjects were really good about continuing their home program. So that home program, instead of 12 weeks, ended up being, in some cases 20, 25 weeks, but they kept it up. But what we did to not lose endpoints, and I would recommend this well, for the next pandemic, hopefully we don't have another one, but is get creative on how to collect the endpoints remotely. So we put together a 6-minute walk test, you know, like others have talked about. You just 6-minute walk test and a wall squat test and a few other things that we made a little instructional video and an instructional handout. And then the spouse usually of the patient would actually conduct the test according to the exact, you know, we gave them very strict, you know, here's exactly what you say at the start of the 6-minute walk test, you know. So was it ideal? No, but we didn't lose those endpoints, which were important. So that was good. I guess that's the main thing I think that I would suggest if this happened again down the road, is just be ready to convert as many endpoints as possible into remote. And that way you're not feeling like you're losing so much. If that helps.
Yeah, thanks.
Mhm.
Questions for Rachel or Stacy?
Thought it was really interesting that Rachel did find a means of accessing this different socioeconomic group. Did you find any change in your statistics, Stacy, in recruitment of various socioeconomic groups with the hospitals?
We did not, and in large part, I think because we have a very captive audience, that they're babies who are in the neonatal intensive care unit. For at least for that study, for our the group we're recruiting from the community now in the 3 sites that are my big kid trial, are 7 to 20-month-old kids. We are seeing some differences, but it's site dependent on who's being recruited socioeconomically. And related to what services are being provided in the community. The biggest thing that we've seen is more families being willing to come back to be an intervention in the sites where they're still doing telemedicine for early intervention, where the parents are so dissatisfied with telemedicine that that's all their kid's been getting for 18 months for therapy, that they want to come back in person. So they'll sign into a study. And so we see some disparities that way, but also a little bit of difference probably socioeconomically that we're seeing as well in that group, but not as much in the NICU.
And Rachel,
Y'all
sorry,
use remote follow-ups, Rachel, in the COVID?
I'm sorry, Steve, could you say that again?
Have y'all used remote follow-ups in the COVID clinic?
Yes. So when we started for the clinic side of the post-COVID clinic, UTMB would not allow us to bring anyone in. We did about 99% of our initial visits via telehealth. So we did that hour-long standardized assessment, and then we would determine based on like a priori cut points what services on Friday we would all get together and talk about each patient, kind of like rounding, but real multidisciplinary. And then they would get tagged for COVID and we determined where they were going to go out. We did then bring in patients for face-to-face if we were concerned about something and we felt like they needed to come in. We were lucky in that our medical director was a pulmonologist. And so the majority of our patients, I think it's 86% of our patients need pulmonary testing and possible, respiratory therapy, not unexpected. And so we were able to bring in a good portion of our patients under that appointment, but then we could tag all these other post-COVID type things like blood draws and other things into that, assessments. But we had a lot of trouble. We could not bring patients in for pulmonary function testing until they had a negative PCR. And we've had some patients that have had chronic positive, like tested positive for COVID chronically for out to 6 months. And so for those patients, it's UTMB's policy is that they can't come in for to have PFTs done or to do pulmonary rehabilitation if they're still testing positive for COVID. And so that was some of the like weird things that we had. We did do follow-up telehealth assessments with our patients, and we've actually gone back to, especially with Delta now coming, we've done follow-up assessments for telehealth with our patients as well to just follow up and see how people are recovering, especially post-rehab. So after patients go through PT or pulm rehab, we tend to follow up with them to see, are there other services that are needed. You did pulmonary, now are you still having, endurance issues? And so we need to send you to PT or vice versa. It's very interesting. It seems like PT and pulmonary run hand in hand, but it's very patient specific as to which one is needed first and second, but most of our patients need both of them. For our research study, we ended up actually setting up that research study because it was in the midst of COVID. We ended up mailing them packets because we had to limit from the IRB standpoint. They would only let us do a 20-minute in-person research meeting. And so in that 20 minutes, I wanted to get height and weight and our short physical performance battery done, as well as some of our additional assessments like hand grip and things like that, which I couldn't get otherwise. And so we ended up mailing them assessments. Now we've done everything on the computer for the most part. But as we were starting up, we ended up mailing them paper copies, having them bring the paper copies back. And then it's just funny to think back because then we put them on a shelf for a week before anyone touched them, before we then entered the data. So yeah, we did some telehealth assessment of short physical performance battery and tried to collect some data that way. Tried to do like 2-minute step test, but just like Stacy was saying, it's hard to have people manage a cell phone and getting themselves in the picture so you can see them and are they doing it correctly, and to have them start and stop at the right time, and all of that was difficult. But we have been doing some remote assessments as well.
Have y'all thought of like what would be an ideal kind of video package to provide participants, at the.
So I'll tell you the funniest thing that we came up with was that if we had everybody buy a bag of rice when they went to the store the next time, or we would send it in our packet, because a cell phone fits beautifully in a bag of rice, like that's not opened, of course. And it just worked as like a bean bag. So everybody had a tripod. That was that, because we looked at what's cheaper to like send people a tripod for their phone. But the bag of rice worked really well.
And then it's food.
A great idea.
I was interested, Rachel, in the there's a big population of people who have had COVID who were being followed by home health after discharge, and home health providers still went into the home post-COVID. They don't wait for a negative test, and they're still doing the OASIS. They're still doing all the, at least getting oxygen saturations, looking at the 6-minute walk test. All that stuff will be recorded from the OASIS on these patients. Is there a way for you to get access to either that data on your patient population or to build a collaboration with the home health agency around that?
That's a really, really good idea. I actually was invited a couple of months ago into the N3C, which is the National COVID Consortium, which is involved with a lot of electronic health records and large data. I'm not sure if the OASIS data is pulled into that, but I've been a part of a couple of projects that's looked at EHR and pulling data from the EHR and trying to be able to identify patients that are long haulers or patients looking at recovery. But that's a really good idea with OASIS and the home health. We do have some collaborations here at UTMB, so I should see if the people that have those collaborations have access to that data and can begin kind of working with it. We've seen some pretty cool things through N3C. At UTMB, our electronic health records, we have a couple of different ways to get into it and look at large sets of data like Trinetics, and there's another one as well. The problem with EHR data a lot of times is that things, and especially with something like COVID, symptoms, for example, like if you want to look at how prevalent is fatigue or how prevalent is change in cognitive function, it's in text if a doctor asks about it. And none of that is really mineable except for by extraction. And then you can do some natural language processing and whatnot, but it's not fantastic. But OASIS would be good because it's drop down for those specific things.
Yeah. Because you're in Texas, I'll say the Encompass healthcare system. So my husband is a home health PT and he worked for Encompass, which is based out of Texas. They also do the mini mental on everybody. The 6-minute walk is all mandated for all of their patients, in addition to what's in the OASIS, and it's all drop down data. And they reliability train their staff first. So like access to that type of data, I think could be really, really interesting to be able to expand kind of what it's looking for. And you've got some good health systems that would have that data.
Yeah,
probably even stronger than what the Oasis could access. And they database theirs privately in addition to the Oasis.
Yeah, home health was very interesting because they did go in right away, and some providers were doing, in Texas, it wasn't cold at any point in time, pretty much. And so they were able to, through this pandemic, do visits if patients weren't comfortable or providers weren't comfortable outside. And it's also very interesting from the hospital side and perspective. Our admissions to nursing homes and to rehab facilities extremely decreased for older adults because that's where everyone was dying. So nobody wanted to go to a nursing home and nobody wanted to go to rehab, even though that's where like our social workers would be like, you can't go home. Like you can't go home. You have to go to a nursing home. And people would go out of their way to go home, have friends come and live with them. Like nobody wanted to go to the nursing home. And so home health during the pandemic was even more used. So it would be very interesting to see kind of what they collected, because you're right, they did go into a lot of homes.
Yeah, it'd be it'd be interesting to see if they had similar outcomes. The people who went into the nursing homes.
Yeah, I'm interested, Rachel, too. If you are you guys following any children within your system in the post-COVID clinic, or are they just different?
So our post-COVID clinic, the way that I think for billing purposes, you had to be 18 and you had to have a PCR positive COVID test that you could prove, or an antibody positive test prior to being seen in the clinic. It made it very hard when we first opened the clinic, because back in our earliest people that had COVID, if your husband got COVID and was diagnosed with COVID, and then you got sick, there were so few tests that you didn't go and get tested. But then you might be the one that ended up with long COVID, and now you can't actually receive services at our post-COVID clinic because you never got tested. And now you're 6 months out, and so you're not showing antibodies anymore, or you may never have developed antibodies or whatever it would be. So that made things kind of difficult. We in our clinic aren't looking at children. However, I am collaborating with actually OB-GYN who collected samples from patients that were pregnant throughout. And that's a very interesting cohort, because they were, every time people were coming into the hospital, because we had so many tests here at UTMB, because we have the Galveston National Laboratory, they were doing nasal swabs and COVID tests every time that people were coming in for visits. And so we knew very precisely kind of when people got COVID. So did you get it in your first trimester or second or third? And he's been following actually mother-baby outcomes. And now there's some pediatricians working with him as well, kind of looking at babies that were, that ended up having a mother that had COVID at some point in time in her pregnancy, and watching that follow up. So very interesting. There's not very many ped cohorts of it. And it wasn't very well recognized within pediatric patients for a very long time.
Other questions specific to that? Oh, go ahead, Martha.
Sorry, I had my hand raised. I didn't want to interrupt. I'm so sorry. I completely lost my internet. And so and it took me forever to reconnect back on, but so I kind of missed, Rachel, some of your information. If you could just share with me real quickly, and I hate to take anybody's time, is just like, what is encompassed in your post-COVID clinic? Like, what services are you including? You may have mentioned it, and I'm so sorry.
So the post-COVID clinic is really just a multidisciplinary team approach of looking at a globally what patients need that previously had COVID and are still suffering from symptoms. And then what we do is we do a standardized assessment that focuses on pulmonary, cardiology, PT, OT, nutrition, and we collect some sleep metrics as well. Oh, and behavioral health, so depression, anxiety, impact.
Oh, yeah.
And then we, then based on a priori cut points, we farm out with a COVID tag to a specialty set of clinicians. And so all of our post-COVID PT patients, for the most part, are going to one of two clinicians that are seeing those COVID patients and are used to kind of what types of things that they're suffering from. And so it is kind of we're able to get people into services more quickly. We're able to get people testing more quickly. And it is the ability for them to see providers that all have kind of been a part of this post-COVID world and are more up to date on kind of what's going on. We also, I think there's about 80 clinicians that are invited to the rounds on Friday, but typically those services that I spoke about come every Friday because patients need one of those services or multiple of those services. But we also have reached out to and worked with a lot of GI because we have chronic like nausea and vomiting and diarrhea for months at a time sometimes. We have had patients with hair loss and with other endocrine issues. So we have some specialists in those. And so if we have someone that comes up with like a weird type issue that's maybe a little bit abnormal, we'll invite those specialists to come just to round specifically to talk about those patients. And so patients are farmed out. After they finish their therapies, then we follow up with them again to see what other therapies they might need. We bring them back, we do standard blood panels on them. And the medical director and team, we have quite a few nurse practitioners that work in the team, kind of just oversee, you had all of these different tests done, and what does that mean, and how can we kind of oversee your care?
So the literature that I've read says that 1 in 4 people who have suffered from COVID turns up being long COVID. Have you seen any change in the statistics? Same?
No, I would say it's about the same. The thing that is really hard is that it's probably quite underreported. There was a study that was pretty decently done out of China in which they looked at hospitalized patients, and they looked 3 months out. They sent a survey and they asked a standard battery of, are you suffering from any of these symptoms? 70% in that study were still suffering 3 months out from at least one of those symptoms. Well, is that long COVID? I don't know. The issue is we don't have a definition for long COVID. We don't even have a definition for when long COVID begins. Is it immediately after hospitalization? Is it 3 months out? Is it after recovery from post-ICU syndrome? Does it matter if you were hospitalized or not? Does it matter on discharge date versus first date of, feeling ill? What are the symptoms of long COVID? What are the things we should be asking about? All of those things have not yet been hashed out. The NIH is trying to work on that. There was a huge amount of money put into PASC is the newest name. There's also been like 6 names for long COVID, long haulers, PAX, PASC, long COVID.
Yeah. I'm gonna pause us there just for a moment because we have 5 minutes left. One, we're all learning a ton about this, but what I'd like to just ask while we're all here, one of the things we wanted to touch on, and Stacy had also put it in the chat, is thoughts on moving forward or how this impacted PhD students and programs and the pros and cons of being virtual or trying to be a faculty member who's pivoting research and mentorship into this new model, because as someone said, hopefully the Delta variant will be a smaller bump than it looks like it will be, but there could be, everyone's saying be ready for the next pandemic. So thoughts or insights on either pluses or minuses, so to speak, of how you're managing your PhD students and programs, take-home lessons? If not, we can go back and talk about long COVID. Stacy, do you have thoughts on that? You posed the question, so I'll.
Yeah, I'm just interested in how other people are handling it. Like if you have students who couldn't collect data for 18 months or for even a year, or they didn't get as much practice with doing it, are they ready to propose their own dissertation, in the same timeline if they haven't been actively collecting data? I know there's issues with international students being able to come or getting stuck in locations. Yeah. So I'm more curious as to how people are thinking about it when we may have a group of future faculty who were stuck in this pandemic and really were impacted by it.
We had just quickly a student collecting vestibular and postural data in adults with vestibular, and she had to change her population because the clinics, as we're hearing, if it's part of the clinic standard of care, it may be okay. But she was closed out, and about 6 months into it, she went back to her home country where the clinics there would allow her to collect data. So she brought her 2-year-old with her, stayed with her mother-in-law, and managed to get all of her dissertation data collected very creatively, but it also pulled her away from any timed interaction. It was Saudi, so she was kind of on a flip-flop schedule. And they finally graduated, and interestingly, she was on a government scholarship, and they didn't want to extend scholarships, not even knowing she had collected her data. So I worry about our students, how they're going to view mentorship, or, you know, the whole informal discussions. We can do this by Zoom, but there's so much creativity that I think she and others missed out on because they were just away. But others?
I'll say something I would have done differently now in hindsight. I was doing so much online, as everybody was, that I didn't have lab meetings where it was the whole group meeting by Zoom, because I was trying to spare people from another Zoom meeting. I was teaching online, and, you know, I thought, I'm not going to do it. So I met individually with everybody that was working on a project, and we did these one-on-ones, and I just kept kind of up on everything and knew everything was moving along. But I realized later I did a disservice to my PhD student and to the lab members by not doing that monthly, we're all here in this together, we're all working toward this common mission of the lab, and the mentorship that comes out of, you know, your PhD students, seeing how you are tying the projects together and how you're leading. And so, you know, looking back now, I'm like mad at myself that I didn't have lab meetings. I mean, we went a whole year where I just did all my meetings one-on-one rather than lab. So would I do it again? I would absolutely have monthly lab meetings still. I think I messed that one up. So anyway, you know, lessons learned, right, from the pandemic. So
Don't be too hard on yourselves.
yeah,
You know, nobody had a roadmap on
no, we didn't know. Next pandemic, man, I'm going to do it really well.
Right. You know, I'm 61. I can look back at my career and I can replay and do things a lot better, but, you know, there's a lot of things we could do better, but you guys have got the resilience and grit to move forward and do things in so much more flexible and creative ways than Mary and I had. So you guys are going to be rock stars, and you're going to be awesome, and you're going to do the profession really well in doing what you do. So don't beat yourself up. You know, just look at the outcomes we're producing. Yes, the PhD students are probably some of the ones we have the most concern about, but the DPT students are at least coming out and, you know, doing what they're going to do, and they'll catch up. And so the PhD students will as well. You know, they've got solid foundations, and we all did it. We didn't come out with, you know, think about what we have and what we were built with, and they'll catch up. They will.
I think it's interesting too, because there's been a lot of conversation in the pediatric group we meet every other month for the research pediatric kind of group about people who are early in their tenure track career as well. And unfortunately, or fortunately, the like stance of, well, let's extend everyone's clock. Well, talk about reducing people's financial benefits. You know, incentives. And when you do that, to the vast majority of people who were caregivers during COVID were women. So we, again, are pushing down that the females to say, okay, let's extend your tenure clock. So you're going to, I don't know. So there's lots of issues I think that'll happen. That'll be that trickle down of PhD students. So I think it's just more of an acknowledgement that if the whole profession acknowledges this is going to be an issue, we can all recognize it and move forward.
And you have to go back to, just like with passing the MPTE, there's a minimal standards, and there are minimal things that you can do that get your people over the edge. And the problem with PTs is we're all high achievers, we're high flyers, and you have to keep pointing out to your faculty, what are the actual minimal standards? And then you have to send them out to colleagues and remind them what are the minimal standards. Because if we keep punishing ourselves and our female colleagues who just are always feeling guilty that we don't meet the highest standards, and that's it. That's what I keep saying. You're welcome to add this year, and that just makes you feel good that you have that cushion. But do not expect that you have to meet this minimal standard, because in my opinion, you are meeting the bar, and meeting the bar is, here's what the standards are, and don't sell yourself short, because you're costing. And here's how I unfortunately have to work my female colleagues. I have to say, here's your family, and here, let's project the long-term cost to your family of you now not going up for tenure a year or two, and what that can mean to the financial implications of your children of not having that extra income for them to put in their college fund. And so, because that's how it's sad, but that's the best weapon I have to just like help them, motivate them. Like, it's not about you, it's about your economic impact on your family that you can have, because you meet the bar. Maybe you don't exceed the bar. I think you exceed the bar, but you meet the bar, and the economic impact on your family is this. And the long-term trajectory of you on your family is this, if you go up now versus if you wait a year or two. So.
Good mentoring, Debbie. Love it.
Well,
So it is time. Again, I'd like to thank Stacy and Rachel for sharing. So thank you guys very much. Stacy's at USC. You can find her. I think many of us know her. And Rachel is at UTMB. So I didn't mean, Martha, to cut off your interest in long COVID. I think we all are. But feel free to email Rachel. I know that she would love to continue to teach us all about long COVID as adults, or email Stacy about some of her work. So Debbie, I don't know, or Mary, if you have anything you want to add in closing.
Just say, again, I think these same issues can be discussed and revisited with recruiting PhDs in the next webinar with financial rewards and pitfalls. And it's the same thing. And again, thinking about from the feminist perspective and the male's perspective of how do we recruit and make this look like a outstanding and viable professional choice. And we have to sell it as, we have a lot of good security and a lot of good benefits that I have to continue to sell. The salaries may or may not be better than the clinic, but the job satisfaction and the opportunities are great. So thank you all for participating, and it was a really stimulating and good seminar. Thank you.